Welcome back. I'm glad that was a brief hiatus and we're back.
Yes, we are back.
So how much of the last question I asked did you get?
I got all of it. I don't remember it. Can you ask it again?
Absolutely.
Do you remember it? Okay.
Yes. So my question is, from your background, I would assume, like us, you're a strong advocate of including mysticism into church practice.
Yes.
I've never been, at least growing up, never part of a church that even talked about mysticism. So what I wanted you to do with your background and everything you've experienced is just kind of break down, define mysticism for our audience. And maybe tell me why you think the church is resistant to mysticism in practice.
The answer to that is so complex and also simple. So I'm going to shoot for the simple. I've been studying the mystics really since my late 20s. So this is not a new area for me. The term mystic, it literally means somebody who just is open to the mystery. I mean, it has the same root as mystery. I really have gotten to the point where I define mysticism as just a foundational openness to God, to the sacred, the holy, the divine, the eternal, in just any moment of life, in every moment of life. And I think too often we treat the research into mysticism and mystics as there's this small select group of special people with special powers or whatever. And it's not. That sort of mystical life is really meant for everybody, but it does take intention. The most mystical people I've ever met have been in churches. That's not the same as saying church people are mystical. There's a Quaker author, Thomas Kelly, who talks about an ecclesia and ecclesiola, a church within a church. He says, at the core of every alive church, there is a group of people who are just intensely open to the divine, and they are what keep the church together. Often they're not put on boards, they may not serve on committees, but they are the people of prayer who, when you're in a church, they're the people who they love everybody, they have a sense of God in everything. And so, as a pastor of a church, my whole thing was, how do I blow on that embers and how to grow? But I'll go back. The simple definition for me is it's just foundationally an openness to God, the divine, the sacred, whatever you want to call that, in everything, in everything. It's very a Yoda-esque.
But, when we've talked to other folks with some biblical background, most people believe that there are near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences in the Bible in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul very clearly had one in 2 Corinthians, yeah.
Can you maybe just point a couple of those out to the audience?
Yeah, the clearest one is Paul. Paul clearly had some sort of near-death experience. He talks about it in 2 Corinthians 12. I think it's 12. Maybe it's 10, one of the two, where he's defending himself to the Corinthians, and he starts talking about himself in the third person, where he starts saying, I know a man, whether in the body or out of it, I don't know, God knows, who was taken up into paradise, up into the third heaven, and had things revealed to him that he cannot share or talk about, whether in the body or out of the body, God knows. And then he goes on to talk about those revelations. And, my Lord, if you read any near-death book, especially ones where they, like Howard Storm's My Descent to Death or Peter Panagor's book or any of these books, where they have intensive conversations with God, Jesus, spirits, whatever, you really recognize that in Paul's writings. I think what you also see are, in the Bible, the raising of Lazarus in John's Gospel. Nobody got to interview Lazarus, but I'm pretty sure he had a near-death experience. It would be very interesting because some people meet Jesus in their near-death experience. So, are you meeting Jesus in real life at the opening to the cave, and also your near-death experience? Who knows? There are stories going back. I think the funny thing about the Bible is the Bible treats mystical experiences as though they just happen. And that's what makes it hard sometimes is, there are some like the Pentecost experience, which are kind of over the top, but some of the experiences, the burning bush, which seems so intense, but, Moses has experiences where he's having conversations with God. So, pointing out the most significant, I think, near-death experience is what Paul writes about. And then with some of the prophets, they allude to experiences, and I can't think of passages right offhand, but they allude to experiences where they have a sense of what God's calling them to do. And it's very intuitive, and it's very, they just know because of their experiences.
Were there practical ways that you could implement some of these ideas when you were in ministry?
Yeah, well, to me, it started, the very first thing I did when I came to my church, Calvin Presbyterian Church, I was there for 22 years. The concept I talked before about that church within a church, I really realized that a lot of times where churches go astray is they call forth leaders for their functional abilities. Can they fix sinks? Can they teach a class? Can they handle finances? And almost never do they ask the question, does this person have spiritual depth? Is this person willing to seek what God wants? So we've really changed from the leaders on out to, we wanted those functional abilities, but I also wanted people who had a spiritual openness to God. So we started there with the idea that if you change the leadership, you then change the church. And so, we can talk about practices, but I do think one of the problems of modern Western life is that we're very functional. And so we're always looking for what we can do to get these experiences. I actually think it starts with kind of an openness to the experience. Then you can engage in the practices, and it's kind of like, let's say I want to play music. Well, I'm really open to music, and now I will go and get piano lessons. And I may change techniques, I may change teachers. The teaching and all that, that's important, but the real key is the music. And I think it's the same thing with mystical experiences. The mystics really understand it's the experience. That's what I tried to nurture in the church. And it's what I do. I coach pastors. I consult with churches. I try to help them to become open to where God's leading them, to recognize that God's speaking to all of us. That's how we did mission in our church. It was not a committee that says we should do this, 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 but it was helping people become open to God's call and make that the foundation of if you feel called to do this, we will then support you. As opposed to, so I'm bringing in a lot of different things, but it's not one thing in the church. It's really, preaching in a way that just creates openness to people, and then you can create a contemplative prayer group. You can create an intercessory prayer group. You can do a small group that's all about, we did a near-death experience group in our church, and I told them you didn't actually have to die to be part of the group. But we explored experiences so that we could nurture openness.
Well, that's great. Did you have any resistance when you initially started any of these groups, any of these discussions?
Probably. This sounds funny, but my focus has always been, where's God calling me? And so what I've experienced is, even with the resistance, there were just little coincidences that happened. And I would say, interestingly enough, some of the most resistant people were the people who ended up growing the most and becoming the most open. you know what happened was as we started having this approach in the church, we just started growing. And I think that because of that, people just became on board very quickly. And then we started attracting people who really wanted God experiences, and that itself changed the church. So I had resistance, but to me, it was kind of, I'm following my calling. So resistance is it's like counseling. Your client in the first session is going to resist what you do. So you just work on the trust and building relationships, and then you just keep going.
Do you think I feel like I'm hammering on this point, but over time, because obviously you've written several books and are considered somewhat influential in a lot of evangelical circles, I'd say particularly Presbyterians, but do you feel like people are kind of moving forward with you at this point?
Sorry about that. You got cut off again, and I think this is my internet, and I apologize.
No, it's okay. Well, I was just saying, do you think, as you said you're following this calling where kind of God directs you to go?
Yeah.
Do you feel like people have followed you, like as the church as a whole has kind of moved that direction, or do you think it's still somewhat, at least in the Presbyterian realm? No.
Funny thing is I'm a moderately progressive Presbyterian Church USA pastor. I think we've become less open to it. What has happened in the mainline church is, when I first started, nobody was really open to spirituality. Now they are, but they've reduced it all to practices. The counseling world does the same thing. It's all mindfulness and meditation. In the mainline world, it's do you practice contemplative prayer? Do you practice lectio divina? It still is focused on doing. The interesting thing is, I coach some evangelical non-denominational pastors.
Yeah.
I find they're much more open to the spiritual stuff, and it's creating changes in the non-denominational evangelical world, because they've been much more open to the spiritual, and it's making them rethink their own theological approaches. Where, I've been coaching the executive pastor of a large non-denominational church, and when he and I talk, I'm amazed at the books he's read, because he's read so many of the books that I read for my PhD. I'll mention, oh, well, there's a Quaker, Thomas Kelly, and he goes, oh, I love that book, Testimony and Devotion. It's really been influential on me. And I'm sort of like, wait, nobody knows that book. Brother Lawrence, who you and I mentioned before the podcast. So I think in the mainline church, they don't talk about spiritual experience that much. They talk about social justice, which is really important. They talk about biblical interpretation, which is really important. But I think they're moving even further away from spiritual experience. And I don't really know why, but I think the impact on the mainline church is that it's dying, because people are saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. And they're saying to the mainline churches, you're religious but not spiritual. So I don't see it as being heavily influential. I'm a little bit of a voice in the wilderness, trying to guide people in this area. And a lot of churches have grown by doing this, but the denominations as a whole really struggle.
Yeah, that one's hard for me to understand, because everybody that I talk to in regards to this show feels that the model of like this materialistic worldview that we've had for so long, it's kind of crumbling in the last few years.
Yeah.
And it's not people like us having conversations like this. It's science that's causing it to crumble.
Yeah.
And there's this gap, right? There's a void that could very easily be embraced by the church. So it's crazy.
I'll tell you. So yeah, I apologize for interrupting you, Justin. So last night, I had a group from a church just about an hour away invited me to come down and talk about near-death experiences. So I was supposed to spend an hour, a little bit more, and they spent 2 hours with me, all on this topic, and they were fascinated by it. I mean, they loved it. But they were really kind of a group that within the church that is really open to it. I think science and religion have the same problem, which science doesn't know what to do with experiences that don't fit into a rational matrix. Religion doesn't know what to do with experiences that don't fit into their kind of rational matrix. And the problem with near-death experiences, they don't fit, what happens if somebody has an experience of God that doesn't fit a theological construct? Do you stick with your interpretation, or do you stick with what people are saying? Meanwhile, with science, same problem. They've created kind of their own atheistic theology, and which excludes it. So what do you do with near-death experiences when people have God experiences? It doesn't fit with their own religious perspective. And these neuroscientists, they do have a religious perspective. Science is not science is really just the pursuit of knowledge using empirical means. But I see so many scientists who will say, well, this doesn't make rational sense. It probably is just a dream, or it's hypoxia. Well, that's fine, but they run no scientific experiments proving that. They can make analogies to it, but they're doing the exact same thing that theologians do with these experiences, which is, it doesn't fit my matrix, so therefore it can't be true. What do you do with that? I'm just much more drawn to religion that's grounded in experience, which is exactly what religion is, that the Bible is full of experiences. I don't know if I wandered off answering your question, but I do think it's a reason people are leaving the church in droves. When they say they're spiritual but not religious, the religious community is not hearing them saying, and you are religious but not spiritual.
Do you think in the research that you've done, whether in-person conversations or just, reading, do you see a more comprehensive theology being revealed through near-death experiences, or do you think there's such variety in there that's difficult to do?
Boy, that's both. I do see the near-death community. They are starting to develop their own theologies. They don't see it that way, but they are. But it's theology rooted in, let's study people's experiences and let's find the patterns and the commonalities. So from that perspective, I do see a growing theology growing. I may have lost your question a little bit, but I think in the non-denominational world, the Pentecostal world, they're allowing more challenge to their theological beliefs based on these experiences. Again, the realm I'm coming from, I don't, for example, my denomination, they are completely open to LGBTQ experiences, which I believe they should be. But they still don't know what to do with spiritual experiences, and they get caught up in, do I hold the theology, or do I change in response to the experience? Real key. People have experiences of Jesus in their near-death experiences. Howard Storm writes about his, and My Descent into Death. There have been other people who've written about their experiences. There doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be as much of a theology in those experiences of Jesus based on sacrificial atonement in those experiences. So what do you do? Do you rethink sacrificial atonement, or do you double down on it? Yeah. And it's creating some level of cognitive dissonance where we don't know where to go with it.
Do you think that if conversations like this are more widely accepted, more broad? You mentioned, and I think you've mentioned it in this conversation, but people leaving the church.
Yeah.
And what I find particularly interesting about these types of conversations is all these people leaving the church because maybe they've learned new things, or they find things they disagree with in their denomination's background, or whatever it might be. And I've said to a lot of people, it seems that there is oh, the community in Western culture is very welcoming to deconstruction. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
there's enough people that are saying, let's help you reconstruct a faith.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, from your perspective, because you seem like somebody who would have a good opinion on this, is could conversations like this and more public knowledge of what we're learning about consciousness impact that or change that culturally?
Yeah, you know what? There are two parts to the postmodern movement. One is deconstruction. Basically it's a question of how do you know that's true? I think where the reconstruction comes is the gift of the postmodern age is an unwillingness to accept truth from just one perspective. The potential gift of the postmodern age is to take whatever is truth and look at it from 360 degrees, from a wide variety of perspectives. So that's integrating not only theological belief, but it can be anthropology, psychology. This was part of my PhD. It was studying spirituality, integrating not only sciences, but also art, literature, drama, story, all of this, because all of these create perspective. That's where the reconstruction happens. It's in these conversations where people, where people integrate different perspectives and come at it from a broader understanding. I always think of it like this. This is my model for this. I love this rock. It's an okay rock. What the heck is that? It looks a little bit like mold. And if you just look at it from this perspective, it's a rock. But if you turn it around, it's this incredible geode. And it has other perspectives. But what happens is so often we will look at our own perspective as this and then just assume everybody else's is that. And we're not willing to really take a perspective. And to me, that's where my fascination has been. I'm a therapist, psychology from a lot of different perspectives. I'm a pastor. I've studied the Bible. I've studied theology. I've got a spiritual direction background. I am fascinated with brain structure. I am, and the impact of the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex on things. I'm fascinated with organizational psychology. I'm fascinated with how things work. To me, that's where the possibilities are, is when you're starting to bring this stuff together. And Justin, quite frankly, you're having these conversations, which, it's a small thing. But, added to a lot of other small things, it becomes a bigger thing. I do think there's a movement in the postmodern age of let's look at things from a wide variety of perspectives. It's just that we're not fully in that age where we have people battling over, I'm right and you're wrong. And I'm right because I just feel it. And if you could only feel what I feel, you'd know that I'm right. Well, it's like, okay, that works the other way too. So I think you're right. We have a lot of people who deconstruct truth because they're not willing to accept one perspective. But the reconstruction is coming. How do we integrate a lot of different perspectives? And it's slowly happening in the world, but it takes a long time.
All right, let me ask you a step further here, kind of a loaded question in that same area. Do you think, as some people do, I've talked to people that feel this way, do you think that this change that we're sort of seeing in a post-materialistic sort of worldview is a movement of God?
Yes. I don't know where it's going, but it's kept me in my career, even though I've been pretty heavily criticized. I've been both really praised and really criticized throughout my whole career, and it's kept me in my career because I don't think the way other people do, but I won't walk away. It's certainly, I feel called to it. I think there are a lot of other people who do too. I think God is doing something, but everybody wants to try to figure out what it is, and it's unveiling. And the religious community, the Christian community, other religious communities have a part in it. So does the near-death community. So does the scientific community. It probably will come together when I will say, I will go back to Howard Storm's book, My Descent into Death. He had this pretty extensive conversation with Jesus, and he sees the world in 200 years. And his description is one that I keep going, yeah, I don't know that I see that. Because, boy, it's really a lot of kumbaya, people coming together. And we're sort of in this, everybody hates each other right now world. But, maybe everybody hating each other will burn itself out and lead to something. Ultimately, I do think God's doing something. What it is, we get glimmers and glimpses. The more open we are, I think the more full we see it. But it's, we don't get to see a whole lot. We get to see threads.
So, how many near-death experiences would you say you have encountered in your time?
Do you mean reading or talking with people?
Talking with people.
Boy, I've probably listened to maybe about 30 over the course of my life. But it's,
okay.
Part of the problem is that I have a hard time distinguishing them in nature from so many other spiritual experiences that people have shared with me. I'm fascinated by experience, and near death are part of it. But so I've literally listened to hundreds of people's spiritual experiences, maybe even thousands, but a lot of them may just be really small. Give you an example. Last night I spoke to this group, and they had John Burke's book, Imagining Heaven. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they had just been reading it, and they asked me if I knew the book, and I said, well, yeah, I got it on my Kindle. I downloaded it like a month ago, and then you started talking about it today, and it's like, oh wow, John Burke. I was at an Easter brunch with my aunt, who's very interested in spiritual experiences. Sylvia, she's an incredible woman, and we're sitting and standing in line to get food, and she leans over to me and she says, have you ever heard have you ever heard of a woman named who's had this near death experience named Mary? And I finished her sentence and said, Mary Neal. Yeah, I know, we read her book as part of our group. And then she said, yeah, and I've got this one book that I found fascinating. It's by this psychiatrist, Bruce. I said, yeah, after by Bruce Grayson. I'm halfway through the book. And she was like, this is amazing. But that's, there is this sense that this kind of spiritually open life where you just begin to experience coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. Our center, where we are sad because our clinical director is retiring at age 69, and she's just an amazing clinical director. I mean, just spiritually open, but really grounded as a therapist. And so we've been undergoing this process of looking for a new clinical director, and we've got this one candidate. I mean, hopefully she's going to say yes to us, because we've got one more step to take. But we are in an interview with her, and she's just incredible. And there's so many coincidences just kept coming up in her conversations. And she's part of this spirituality, religion, and ethics in counseling program. And I asked her, like, okay, what is this association you're part of, and how would you describe it? And she said, it's pretty much everything you have on your website for your counseling center. She said, it's amazing because everything you describe your center is exactly how they describe themselves. And she even talks about the coincidences of finding our center and finding out about this opening. And so it's a long way of saying I've listened to a lot of near-death experiences, but I put them in the broad category of just so many spiritual experiences that often I don't separate them out when I hear them, because I've heard so many other kinds of experiences. And to me, that's that looking at things from that 360 degrees. Near-death experience are a particular kind of experience that is in a much larger category of spiritually transforming experiences that go from really minor things to really, Jeffrey Olson's Knowing book of just his just amazing, amazing understandings of the nature of life.
Yeah, that's a incredibly the idea of shared death experiences is something
Yeah,
I'd love for us to delve more. I mean,
yeah.
just as a show because it doesn't make any sense from a scientific perspective.
But but
But
but science, again, scientists often, it actually does make sense from a scientific perspective if you're willing to investigate it. It doesn't make sense from an atheistic scientific perspective. And they're really, I think to me it's really important to separate science out. Science is just the pursuit of knowledge through empirical means, in the same way that we pursue knowledge through a lot of other means too. Um, it's whether you attach atheism to the science, and science to me is just agnostic. It's neither for God against God. It neither says yes to spiritual experiences or against it. Science, literally, all it really attempts to do is to gain knowledge through empirical studies, and people don't really quite understand that. Bruce Grayson's book, After, is really all about him using empirical methods to understand near-death phenomena. And that's what he does. And he's not really arguing against scientists. He's just arguing against atheistic scientists who believe that science is atheistic when it really just isn't. It's neither.
yeah, his work is incredible to me because he's so
Absolutely.
authentic. Like when you talk to him, everything he says, he writes, he believes. He's not.
Yeah.
There's absolutely zero spin with him.
Yep.
Let me ask you. Let me ask you another personal question here because I think this is really fascinating. You've talked a lot about spiritual experiences and how they've impacted you. Have you ever encountered? I don't. I don't know how far I can go with this, but have you ever encountered someone else's spiritual experience, near-death experience, that impacted your worldview?
I can't. So let me say, not a near-death experience, other than reading all these near-death. Every time I read one, it impacts me. So let me share an experience that led me eventually to get my MSW, my MDiv, and really move this into that. I was working as a therapist in a psychiatric hospital in Virginia, and we had a patient, a teen who was not doing well, bipolar. We thought we were going to be sending him to a long-term facility. I was his primary therapist, and I came in, and I, he kind of, I'm trying to make this really short because boy, it's such a big experience, and I write about it, and I talk about it a lot. He said, Graham, I want to share something with you, but I don't want you to just tell me as part of my illness. And the therapist, I'm supposed to tell him anything that's weird is part of the illness. And he just said, I saw Jesus in the window yesterday or a few days ago. And, I didn't know what to say. I'm a 23-year-old therapist without enough training. And I said, well, what did your psychiatrist say? And he said, well, it's all part of my illness. And what did your group therapist say? Well, he said, it's part of my illness. And I asked him what Jesus was doing, and he said, well, he's standing on a path, and it forks behind him, and on one path are derelicts, and one path are successful people. And I didn't know what to say to him. Interestingly enough, coincidentally, I had just read a book 2 weeks before that was talking about hallucinations and delusions with bipolar and other illnesses, and it had suggested that often people can have visual hallucinations which give guidance. So I said, well, what do you think Jesus is telling you? And he said, well, I think Jesus is telling me I have a choice I have to make. I can either keep going the direction I'm going, I end up on that path, or I can choose to get better and be successful. And I think you got to do what Jesus is telling you to do. Now, I'd walked away from the church. I didn't know what to do with Jesus at the time. A week later, he's smiling as I come in, and he said, I saw Jesus again. And I said, okay, well, what was happening? And he said, well, it was weird because we were standing on a football field, and we were at the 50-yard line, and there was a chain link fence between us. He was on one side, I was on the other. I looked back, and the grass was dead from the 25-yard line to the end zone. And I, said, well, what do you think Jesus is telling you? And he said, I think Jesus is telling me I've gone from death to life, but I have obstacles I have to overcome. Instead of sending him to the long-term facility, we discharged him to home about 2 weeks later. And a year later, I saw his father, and his father just said, I don't know what you guys did, but you guys brought our son back. And he said, he's just been accepted into one of the top universities in the state. He got straight A's. I mean, he's just doing incredibly well. And that was an experience that really transformed me because I was pursuing my own kind of spiritual path. And it really opened me back up to Christianity, but it also said, God can even, he was bipolar. I still think God was using his illness to communicate something. Christ was calling, and that was really transforming. That's what eventually led me to get the dual degree, from Pitt and Pittsburgh Seminary, because I wanted to know, like, if I'm going to work with people like this, how do I respond? And it just continued to open up all these things. So I realize it's not a near-death experience, and this is a near-death experience podcast, but it was an experience of something beyond that had a transforming impact on him and vicariously a transforming impact on me. Being a pastor in a church of listening to people's stories has always transformed me. Working with clients, I work mostly with pastors, and I will open them up, where do you experience God? And they will share things with me that even as a pastor, they've never felt comfortable sharing with other people. Including one pastor who told me he became a pastor because he got hit by a golf ball walking by a golf course, and it floored her, knocked her out, and she felt God's incredible love. Everywhere she described it was very similar to a near-death experience, except she said, I didn't think I died, but she had an experience of God, which led her to into seminary and ministry. So they're not near-death experiences, but they are spiritual experiences. And I guess that's part of what I feel like I'm trying to normalize near-death experiences as part of this whole range of spiritual experiences. They're gift experiences, that unfortunately also have physiological issues that go with them, and sometimes very, very long recoveries.
It seems like that would make sense. What the story you just told was that was interesting to me too, because I remember, and I've said that before on this show, working with people and them describing their experience and going, "Oh man, yeah, they've lost it in there," But it seems like an important point, because and possibly a reason that a lot of people, younger folks, have left the church is they don't have that connection with God. It's more about the religious practice, than that continuing path. So it's really interesting to me that what I'm hearing you say essentially is bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, whatever may be going on, there's possibility of God working in those situations in ways that we wouldn't typically.
Yeah. And it can be a both and. I mean, I think the medication also helped him. He was on some form of lithium at the time, and I'm sure that also helped him get better. But also the experience did. And that illness may have opened him up to that experience.
So right now, you spend most of your time counseling, and I'm assuming you said you're still working with church leaders and leaders in general, correct?
Yes, I'm the executive director of a good-sized counseling center, where we actually train our therapists. The foundation is still counseling, but we train them in spiritual integration to become more open to how do we use people's innate spirituality or religious background as strengths. And, we do quite a bit of working with people who've had church hurt and church trauma, which is a real thing. I work primarily as a spiritual director, coach, and somewhat counselor with mostly clergy, of trying to help them, you know, become better pastors, become better leaders, to help their churches become healthier. And a large part of this is opening them up to the spiritual.
What motivates you now to get up in the morning and continue this type of work? Because I know it's been, you said you've learned throughout your entire life, you know.
Yeah. A great TV show on Netflix called The Chosen. It may be one of the best portrayal of Jesus and the disciples and things. There's something that really hit me. There's where he's visiting his mother, and Jesus sits on the edge of his bed, and he kind of prays to God, you know, Lord, thank you for restoring me in body, mind, and spirit overnight, and help me to serve you every day. I feel the same way getting up every morning, where, you know, and I've actually started doing his little practice that I picked up from the TV show, of, you know, before I get up, kind of saying that prayer. What gets me up, every single day, I have sort of some kind of God experience, and I feel like I'm really making life better for people, and not in any way that anybody's going to really notice, but it makes a difference to the ones I'm with. And yeah, I think about this. I'm running a counseling center. You know, we do 12,000 sessions a year. Every single session with every single therapist, with every single client, is healing in some way. That gets me up. It's, you know, I get to be, you know, I get to be the head of an organization that is healing people every single day. I'm not watching it, because, you know, when we're doing really well, all of our doors are closed. But, you know, we've got this incredible group of therapists, and, you know, I don't even want to say it's a privilege. It's just, it's that gets me up. It's the joy of knowing that I'm doing something that's healing every day. And then I get to do one-on-one stuff. I mean, to me, this podcast fits into that. You know, I get to talk about experiences. I get to talk about God. I get to talk about, I get to talk about me, but, you know, I get to talk about stuff that's transforming. And that, to me, is like, it's this never-ending source of energy.
What's a kid?
Interesting. So I didn't have kids till I was 40. So my daughters, all their friends have parents who are significantly younger than me. And I asked them a question one time where I said, is it kind of weird, like, having a father who's 10 years, 15 years older than all your friends' father, who has twice as much energy as them? And they both laughed at me and they said, Dad, you have more energy than our friends. But I think there's this kind of, to me, I really believe in this kind of concept of there's a spiritual flow that happens when you become open to God and the divine, the holy, whatever you want to call it. There's like a spiritual flow that happens, and it starts to become your own energy. The Apostle Paul talks about it, that we have this glory of God in clay jars, but it's this spirit that's in there, and if we let it, it can really flow through everything we do. And so that's what gets me up. It's, you know, it also means by 10 o'clock at night, I'm really, really, really tired. But, I don't know. I wake up with a lot of energy because it always feels like I get to, you know, I get to talk about God and God experiences, and I get to kind of cultivate them. And, you know, whether it's in a church or a counseling center or just people I know, it's really, you know, I don't know. Can I ask myself a question and then kind of add on to what I just said? My question would kind of be, so Graham, what would you say to people who've had intensive experiences, including near-death experiences, that have been transforming of their lives, and you know, they're now living these lives of love? And I would say to that, to answer the question is, when you have experiences, and it can be a near-death experience, it can be a born-again experience, it can be some other kind of experience. Sometimes the tendency of humans is to worship those experiences and keep trying to go back to them. But those are experiences that are meant to propel you forward. A born-again experience, you can't go back and have it again. The idea is you've now entered into this kingdom, this other life. The near-death experiences, you have had a gift. It's now teaching you how to live life. Focus on how it's calling you to live. The near-death experience is guiding you, but the key is, what are you going to do with your life? And I think that's true of all these realms of spiritual experiences. They're gifts that propel you towards a way of kind of healing life, making life better. And I think that to me is really, that's what's really important about all of these experiences. Study the near-death experiences, but use what you learn to propel you forward in life.
So let me ask you a practical question for people who might hear this and say, I want to have a more spiritually focused prayer life or something like that. Are there spiritual practices that you would recommend?
Yeah. So part of my training has always been, training in a lot of different contemplative prayer, journaling, all that kind of stuff. I'll tell you where I've really settled on, and hopefully this podcast won't end right here too. What I've really settled on is there are a number of mystical writers throughout the ages who have offered a way. They include Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, who talked about how bad he was at prayer, but turned cleaning the kitchen and sweeping raisins into prayer. He would go out into the marketplace responsible for finding wine, and he would turn that in prayer. God, what wine are you calling me to buy? And the brothers in his community said, ever since Brother Lawrence started buying the wine, it's the best wine we've ever had. They're the 17th century French monastery, so wine's really important. There was a Congregationalist mystic, Frank Laubach, who was a missionary to the Philippines in the 1920s, and he talked about practicing the presence of God, where he wanted to turn every moment of his life into an awareness of God. Yeah. And he talked about how, as he did this, he found that this infusing of God into everything, that he would turn around to find something and find it already there. He would be trying to move into something and he would find the way already prepared. The Quaker Thomas Kelly writes about this. He talks about how within each of us is a divine presence, a light within, a Shekinah of the soul, the presence of God in our midst, a slumbering Christ ready to be awakened to live out life through us. And so the most basic practice I come from is culled from all of these, or the anonymous writer of The Way of the Pilgrim, who's a Russian Orthodox starets who was on a pilgrimage. It's just having this ongoing conversation with God. It's don't just do the formal prayers, but you're driving your car, turn off the radio, turn off the music, drive in silence, let your mind wander, but also talk to God. Whatever your mind wanders to, turn that into a topic of prayer. If you're really irritated over something someone has said, turn that into prayer. I've done this with people in counseling. When you're really struggling, turn that into prayer. The ability to turn everything into this conversation with God, that to me is what it does, is it creates an openness. And then you can do practices like contemplative prayer. I really see so many things as practice. You go into church, you sing songs, that's a practice. Listening to a sermon, that's a practice. Reading a book, that's a practice. But you can turn watching a TV show into a practice. You're watching a mystery, I don't know, CSI, something like that. If you're open in like this ongoing openness, somebody may say something and all of a sudden it hits you. This is an answer to my struggles. Or you're listening to a song and a lyric from Taylor Swift or the Moody Blues, or somebody comes through and, it impacts you. And that to me is the ultimate practice of this ongoing conversation with God. And then you can also do all these other practices. Read, pray, all of it. but the foundational is recognize, it's what St. Patrick said, almost 2,000 years ago in Ireland, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in mouths of friends and stranger, Christ in times of peace and danger. It's recognizing there's this presence of God. I'll finish this last thought because now you can see the energy is coming through me, and I now can go forever on it. John's gospel really is talking about this when Jesus says, "I'm the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Where Jesus says, "I'm in the Father, and the Father is in me, and I am in you, and you are in me." There's this spiritual flow that can happen, and it's living a life that allows that flow to just come through everything we do.
Well, there's obviously this conversation seems like talk for hours.
Yeah.
I know you've written a lot of books, and so we can, listeners can find those anywhere that, books are sold. But where would you advise viewers, listeners to go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Well, they can Google my name. I actually do have a website that I've put up. Actually, I didn't put the website up so much for me. I put up for churches a lot of free resources up there that don't even have my name on it. Small group guide on how to create a spiritual small groups, resources for turning meetings into times of prayer and spirituality, music resources, but it's ngramstandish.org, and you can find me there. For books, you can go to Amazon. I've written 10 books. They're up on Amazon. It's not hard. Just put N Standish in there. N is my first initial. It stands for Nevin. I do, if you Google counseling.net, that's our counseling center. I have a biography on there. I'm not hard to find. It's also not hard to find some critics who, I remember there was a talk I was giving in Indianapolis where there was a fundamentalist pastor who wrote something out there on the internet saying, "Don't let that mystical Graham Standish talk to you about mysticism. Mysticism is of the devil." I'm paraphrasing. It didn't quite write it that way, but you can even find some critics up there. But my stuff is pretty easy to find out there.
Yeah, I don't think we have a lot of listeners that will be coming to any of your speaking events to engage in a lot of criticism. But do you have any speaking engagements coming up anywhere?
Yes, I do, and I'm not remembering where they are. There's one I'm doing in the fall. Most of these are for particular things. They're not I'm just talking on this topic. I know that I'm giving one in South Carolina sometime next year. I think I'm doing one in the fall. At Samaritan, we do offer workshops, but they're mostly for clergy, and it's typically on, for example, I just finished up several workshops. I just did one for a counseling center in Iowa on nurturing God experiences in the church. And we just did a workshop, several workshops for Samaritan on nurturing God experiences in the church. I just don't know them offhand. I mean, because I also am sprinkling in a lot of preaching engagements. I'm preaching in different churches in the Pittsburgh area over the summer, one in Johnstown, my home church in Zelienople, where I came from, several others around the Pittsburgh area.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today. We're trying to be respectful of your time and not go over most of the time, but we had some technical difficulties today.
Yeah, and it was my fault. Our internet, I don't know why, but it decided today to kind of flood up. It just may be some kind of darkness trying to keep us from talking. Who knows? Justin, I really appreciate you. I appreciate the fact that you do this. You're delving into an interesting area, and I think you asked the question a long time ago. Do you think, I'm paraphrasing, but sort of seem like God's doing something? And I think there's a lot of little things God is doing, let's accumulate into a lot of big things. And I think what you're doing is part of that. And we're all coming from a lot of different perspectives, but it's the bringing together of these things that, it's getting us that, coming at it from a lot of different perspectives.
Well, I really appreciate that, but I'd love to, if we can, have you back at some point as well,
Yeah,
and maybe delve some more
that'd be
stuff.
fun.
Yeah, would you be open to that too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is, this stuff is part of what I do anyway. So yeah, that's great.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin.